revelations from the case files of Lieutenant Joe Kenda. First, a 9-month-old baby is rushed to the hospital under mysterious circumstances.
This could involve child abuse involving a death. That's not something I take lightly.
These people should not be among us. They're dangerous, they're evil.
To catch a monster, investigators must go undercover, but they quickly find themselves in the crosshairs.
They planned to have the lead detective, who was me, killed.
We knew you were a rat. We didn't know how much of one.
Then, a beloved grandmother is gunned down in broad daylight.
When you emptied a gun, it's because you're angry. And angry speaks to motive.
I had no idea it could come to that.
He could have stopped at any time, but he took deliberate acts to execute what he wanted to do.
People can be very disappointing. They can do incredibly evil things. In my view, there's nothing more evil than her.
Order up.
In a diner on the west side of Colorado Springs, a man enters with a mission.
Recognized the description of the man that he was supposed to meet.
Coffee?
Thank you.
So you understand what you're supposed to do?
Some people you want me to scare, right?
It's not scare.
You mean?
This is all the information you need. You need to kill the mother first, and then I need you to go back and kill the baby. You understand?
Yeah, I do.
I was outside the city doing an interview in the county. I was on my way back.
Match to Kenda.
Go for Kenda.
Because radio equipment in the 80s and 90s wasn't that good. There were a lot of dead spots, particularly on the outskirts of the city.
Memorial Hospital, an infant in critical condition, child unresponsive.
I make out the words infant, child, and unresponsive. And the concern of the dispatcher was this could involve child abuse involving a death.
10-4, Kenda out.
That's not something I take lightly.
At the hospital,
Hey.
The victim's name is Samantha.
Poor, and she's going to school.
The daycare worker who called it in, Wanda Crawford, she's in the waiting room.
Wanda Crawford cares for 5 kids in her private residence.
Feel better?
And she was taking care of Samantha at the time of this situation.
So what happened?
The nurse doesn't know. We have limited information right now.
At this important investigation, all we know is that Samantha suddenly stopped breathing.
Outside inside.
outside the hospital room, Kenda and Walker get a closer look at a grim scene.
In the hospital, Samantha looks like one of those dolls that you learn to do CPR on. She's covered with tubes, she's got lines going everywhere. It must have been heartbreaking for her parents.
Excuse me, doctor.
Yes. Can you tell us the baby's condition?
The most important thing on a child abuse investigation is the injuries and the timeline of those injuries.
She's suffering from a subdural hematoma.
And so I learned from that doctor.
The prognosis does not look good, but we're going to do everything we can.
And the baby was injured at daycare?
Not necessarily. It could have happened at home and worsened later. We have some more tests to run before we'll know for sure, and I'll try to keep you posted.
Let's go see what Wanda Crawford has to say.
Wanda is the last person in contact with this baby that observes some sort of injury.
Miss Crawford?
So we want to speak to her to determine what may have happened.
I'm Lieutenant Kenda. This is Detective Walker.
Is she gonna be okay?
Oh, I'm sorry to say it's not looking good. The doctor's doing everything they can.
I can't believe this is happening. Poor, sweet baby.
Wanda Crawford looks like absolutely the person you would want to trust your child with. She just seems like rock solid and really concerned.
You can start by telling us a little bit about your daycare service.
Well, I run it out of my home, but, it's just me. I don't have any other employees.
She reports that she is licensed by the state of Colorado, and she's been...
Do you have any children of your own? Are you married?
I don't have kids, but yes, I am married.
Her husband is James Darnell. He doesn't have any part of the daycare center, but he is a school bus driver for elementary kids.
So what happened this morning? What time did Samantha arrive?
Well, Stella dropped her off around 8 on her way to work. And then I guess it was like around 9:30 or so that I went to check on Samantha and noticed, Samantha was having issues.
Wanda said when she got closer, it appeared that the baby had thrown up a bunch of mucus and was having trouble breathing.
I thought maybe she was having a seizure, so I called 911 right away.
What do you think caused Samantha's injuries?
I'm not really sure. I would talk to Stella. Maybe something happened at home before she dropped Samantha off.
In my experience, there's a lot of child abuse committed by the parent. Through disciplining the child, if you lose your temper and jerk on them, you could cause injury.
All right, well, thanks for talking to us.
Let me know if you need me.
What do you think?
Let's talk to the parents. Why don't you take Tony, I'll take Stella.
During their conversations, Kenda and Walker will be looking for signs of a disconnect between parent and child.
Tony, I'm Detective Walker, Colorado Springs Police. I need to have a word with you.
Sorry.
If a parent refers to their child as it, for example, they don't use the child's name. It's a distance that is between them and that child. So if you hear that, then the alarms go off.
Walk me through the morning before work.
Just like any other morning. Help get Samantha ready for daycare.
Here we go. Yes.
Tony told me he strapped the baby in to get on their way to daycare.
I'll call you later.
I love you, babe.
Love you too.
And Samantha waved at him and said, "Dada."
Yeah.
And they drove away.
All right.
At the other end of the hall, Kenda is listening to Stella's version of events.
It was a normal day. We got Samantha ready for daycare, and I dropped her off with Wanda around 8.
Stella said, all I know is Samantha was in perfect...
And how would you describe your home life?
Good. I mean, it's hard because we both have to work, but it's worth it. Samantha brings so much joy in our lives. I just can't believe this is happening to us.
Baby Samantha was absolutely the light of Tony and Stella's lives. It was a planned pregnancy. They really wanted this baby. There's nothing you can do to even touch the amount of grief they have.
I'm very sorry. Thank you.
Paging Dr. Young. Dr. Young, emergency 3.
So what do you think?
What he told me made sense.
Yeah, Stella too.
To both Walker and I, they come across as quite truthful.
What do you say we stop by Wanda's house? See if we can pick up some sort of lead there.
Yeah, that might be our best shot. I'll meet you over there.
All right.
Wanda's home is a potential crime scene. It occurred in her house. So let's go see what it can tell us, if anything.
Try again.
Where is she?
Oh, hi, detectives. I hope you haven't been staying out here too long.
Wanda looks like she's under the influence of alcohol and acts like it. She's sort of a little bit wandering in her speech and on her feet.
Miss Crawford, have you been drinking?
Well, yeah, I had a couple scotches. I couldn't stop thinking about that poor baby, and I needed to take my mind off of what happened.
Well, that's a little odd. Okay, fine. You're home.
You mind if we take a look inside your house?
Come right in. This is my husband, Jim. He just got home from work. This is where I take the kids, play. It's a little bit messy. I haven't had time to clean up, though.
Nothing about this home indicates anything other than a normal type of residence you would see who is in the daycare providing business.
Do you have a copy of your daycare license and the CPR certificate the state requires?
You bet. Let me go get it.
A government bill to crack down on laboratory experiments.
Do you mind turning that off for the time being?
Animal rights activists.
So what, you're gonna interrogate my wife?
Wanda's husband, Jim, is not quite the nurturant, warm counter.
He doesn't talk a whole lot. I kind of felt that he had something that he was hiding.
Okay, here you go. One signed daycare license and one signed CPR certification.
Can I hold on to these for now?
Sure, honey. Whatever you need.
Where was the baby when you found her?
Oh, right over there next to the chair. That's where she threw up.
So I go over to where Samantha was laying and started feeling the carpet.
It's totally dry.
That's because I caught most of the vomit in a washcloth when she threw up.
So then I asked her where the cloth was, and she said, I've already washed it and put it away. I felt she was covering her tracks.
Wanda, we need you to be totally straight with us. Is there something you're not telling us?
And then she says something out of the blue that's completely different from what she said earlier in the day.
I already told you everything. I came in to check on Samantha. She was standing there drinking her bottle. She fell back and hit her head.
Is that so?
Really? She's changed her story's ability. A 9-month-old baby standing up and drinking at the same time, keeping its balance? Please, not possible. Not at age 9 months.
So you actually saw this happen?
Uh-huh.
Wanda, you're being a little careless with the truth. We are trying to determine the nature of the injury to this child, a 9-month-old baby named Samantha DeFazio, and who may be responsible for such a terrible thing. And we're beginning to be very concerned about the daycare provider, Wanda Crawford.
All right, Wanda, we're looking into a few things. We'll be in touch.
Okay, I'll be here.
She's full of crap. Let's get hold of that 911 call.
Sounds good.
The 911 Emergency Contact Center maintains recordings of all calls. They can produce a cassette tape from their master tape.
Ready?
So we listen to it.
I run a daycare over here on Rushmore Drive, and one of the babies doesn't appear to be breathing.
Can you perform CPR on the baby?
No.
What?
We have her CPR certification that she had in her home. But yet, if she doesn't know anything about CPR, then how does she have a certification?
She's either grossly incompetent or she's lying.
Yeah, something's not right.
I'll see what I can find.
Sounds good.
I checked her status as a care provider, and I learned that there were 6 complaints.
In one of those, a 6-month-old baby had been found comatose and unresponsive in Wanda's care, which is remarkably similar to the current circumstances of Samantha DeFazio.
Lieutenant. Can't say I'm not surprised.
We submitted our certification that she had for CPR to CBI.
Wow.
They determined it was a forgery.
Unbelievable.
The woman's a complete fraud.
Yeah, I wouldn't want my kids anywhere near her. All right, thank you.
To make this a chargeable, winnable case, we need medical evidence to say what exactly happened to this child and when did it happen.
Kenda and Walker return to the hospital.
The doctors have now completed their thorough examination of this child,
And that's all in addition to the head and brain injuries I told you about earlier.
The child has serious and permanent nervous system injuries. The child's retinas were detached from her eyes, and the child is blind.
I think it's a classic example of shaken baby syndrome.
Shaken baby syndrome is a medical diagnosis of picking up a small child and violently shaking them, causing their head to snap back and forth.
The number one reason for shaken baby syndrome is the crying. Babies can cry relentlessly. It can all be very trying, and it starts to make you crazy. It doesn't take that much shaking to kill a baby. It's almost immediate.
Do you know what time this occurred?
Probably just before the medical personnel arrived, maybe 15 minutes.
The child had been in Wanda Crawford's home by Wanda's own admission, alone with the child, for 90 minutes when she called for medical assistance.
Lieutenant Kennedy, dispatch.
So now, there's only one suspect, and it's Wanda Crawford.
While Kenda and Walker head back to give her one last chance to come clean.
You're crazy, okay? I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't hurt that child.
Wanda, we have evidence that shows...
I don't care about your damn evidence. You're both a bunch of damn fools.
Wanda has moved from being Grandma Wanda into a shrieking woman, denying everything and calling us everything but human beings.
I'm placing you under arrest. Please stand up.
Oh, you son of a bitch! I hope you both rot in hell.
Get up.
But even without a confession,
Hands behind your back.
Kenda has a pretty good idea on what happened to baby Samantha.
Stella DeFazio arrives as usual,
Hi, Miss Wanda.
provides the baby to Wanda Crawford.
Alrighty. See you later.
Bye.
Everything's pretty normal.
Uh-oh, that sounds like Samantha. Let's go see what's wrong, okay?
She heard Samantha crying in her crib upstairs,
Samantha, what's wrong, huh?
as babies do, but 90 minutes worth.
Hold still.
Wanda Crawford had a bad temper, and at that particular moment, that child crying was the last straw for her.
Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! Oh, shut up! You think you're a kid?
And she picked that child up and violently shook the child.
Oh my God. Oh, go ahead.
Wanda shook Samantha so violently that the baby's turning black and not breathing. She's scared. She doesn't know what to do.
Yes, I run a daycare over here.
She then became concerned that baby was going to die, but she would have even greater difficulty explaining, so she called 911. And it unravels from there. The result of it is it puts her in jail.
While Wanda's arrest does bring some comfort to the DeFazio family, the injuries she inflicted on their daughter will never heal.
As a result of Samantha's injuries, she will spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. She can't see, she can't hear, she can't eat by herself. It's tragic.
Wanda Crawford is convicted and sentenced to the Colorado State Penitentiary for 18 years. She's 65 years old. It is likely she will not survive her sentence.
But unfortunately, faced with the prospect of a life behind bars, she desperately searches for a way out.
Hey, Jenny. I hear you're getting out of here in a few weeks. You thought any more about what I asked you?
What happens with Wanda Crawford is from the day she is sentenced, she starts developing her escape.
I'll get you the money once it's done. Make it look like a suicide.
And that escape is to put a hit on Stella DeFazio and Samantha DeFazio.
Do you know, Wanda, I always knew you were evil. I didn't know that you were that evil. Wanda Crawford's been convicted of child abuse, and Wanda's attempting to hire an assassin to kill Stella DeFazio and baby Samantha.
Yeah, Wanda approached another inmate named Jenny Larkin about doing the killing for her.
We get a call from the Department of Corrections.
We get a lot of jailhouse snitches that want to supply information to lighten their sentence.
Detectives meet with the prison informant to learn the details of Wanda's scheme.
Please have a seat. I'm Lieutenant Kendall, Detective Walker. Thank you for coming to talk to us. Can you tell us exactly what Wanda told you?
She's been looking for a way to get out of prison for a while now. She said when her husband Jim came to visit that they figured out how to do it.
Wanda wants to make it look like a suicide with a suicide note stating that Stella's the one that injured her baby, not Wanda.
Once everyone reads the note saying I didn't do it, they have no other option but to exonerate me.
That's crazy.
Look, there's $5,000 in it for you. My husband will give you all the information once you get out.
So Jim Darnell is involved in this plan too. But to build a case against him, we're going to have to show he has active involvement.
Would you be willing to help us just a little bit more?
Like how?
We wired the inmate and had her ask Wanda how to commit the murder.
What if she figures out I'm lying?
She won't. Just stick to the script.
She's told to tell Wanda that she's unwilling to do it herself because she's never done that sort of thing, but she has this cousin.
My husband Jim and I only got $5,000. Will that be enough?
I don't know, probably. I'll have to check with him now.
All right, here's what we're gonna need him to do, okay?
Wanda came up with this plan, how she wanted it done.
And then you gotta make a suicide note that's real convincing.
She wants Stella DeFazio to write a suicide note saying, I hurt my baby and I made Mrs. Crawford take the blame. May God forgive me.
Oh yeah, and one other thing. Tell your cousin he's gotta kill Stella's baby.
What? The baby?
The kid's gonna suffer with these injuries her whole life, all right? It's the only humane thing to do.
Wanda, we knew you were a rat. We didn't know how much of one. Now we do.
Tell your cousin if he has any questions, talk to my husband Jim, okay?
These people should not be among us. They're dangerous, they're evil, they're without remorse. It just makes you want to go to the bathroom and vomit.
At this important investigation, we had enough on Wanda Crawford to charge her with the solicitation to murder charge. What we didn't have was the husband, James Darnell.
In order to nab James Darnell, Colorado Bureau of Investigations agent Louie's cousin.
You got a bus word picked out yet?
Not yet. Let's go with the word smoothie.
All right, on smoothie, we'll move in.
Now, does an undercover agent have to be an actor? Not really. You don't have to say much. You're supposed to be a stone killer. No one expects you to be talkative.
What we're looking for is for Jim to tell our undercover officer,
Richardson?
Yeah.
what he wants him to do. But we don't know if Jim Darnell is armed or what he's going to do if this thing goes sour.
So you understand what you're supposed to do?
Some people you want me to scare, right?
No, it's not scare.
You mean?
Yeah, that's right.
Jim confirms it. I want the baby dead. I want the mother dead. I want them all dead. Because I don't want to be alone. I want my wife out of prison.
And there's one more thing I need you to do.
Jim hands instructions on what he wants the suicide note to say.
Have Stella write this out just like it is before you do the job. You understand?
Yeah, I do.
And now we have sufficient evidence to convict everybody involved.
Waitress, can I get a smoothie over here?
Your hands! Bruce! Bruce! Keep your hands up! Get up now! Get up!
Yes.
You're out!
You're under arrest.
He's slimy.
Hands behind your back! All right, let's go. Let's go.
And the darling husband, Jim, is handcuffed. Taken to the county jail on this charge of solicitation to commit murder. And what do you know? Jim is almost as smart as his wife, and he speaks to an inmate.
Jim wanted to have a judge, a senior deputy district attorney, and the lead detective, me, killed for sending his wife to prison.
And what does this inmate do? Dutifully reports it because it might be an advantage to him to so do. So now Jim gets hammered again for a second charge of criminal solicitation.
In 1998, James Darnell pleads guilty to criminal solicitation of first-degree murder. Wanda Crawford is given an additional 32 years on top of her original 18-year sentence.
Happily, Wanda Crawford never got out of prison to hurt anybody again. She died in prison at the age of 87, and so, sorry, vengeance is mine on this one. She lived a good damn long life.
The real tragedy of this case is Samantha DeFazio. She missed out on so much in life because of one cruel person. She died before her 19th birthday. If you are frustrated with a child, walk away. The frustration will pass. If you succumb to your emotions and you cause enormous harm to that person, someone just like me is going to show up and grab you by the throat.
Coming up, a cold-blooded murder in broad daylight has Kenda on a desperate search for answers.
It's unusual to have a person over the age of 60 suffer multiple gunshot wounds. Those kinds of crimes are reserved for the young.
I'm gonna get you for that one.
A 12-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl were playing in the backyard of an apartment complex. It was hot, it was summer, and they were just having a really good time.
Is that firecrackers? Let's go check it out.
They come around the corner, and what they find is a woman covered in blood, slumped face up against the front of the building.
Within the hour, Kenda arrives at the apartment complex.
This is more of a retirement community, so the people there are generally older and they're naturally curious just as much as anybody else.
Some of these people view this as entertainment from their perspective. There's an old man sitting in a lawn chair, drinking a beer, and watching the proceedings like it's a movie.
She had multiple gunshot wounds on the head and chest. We just got word that she was DOA at Memorial Hospital.
They identified her as Dolores Wells. She's 64 years old and she's a resident of the complex.
My mom moved into this apartment complex. She would meet people and they would like her right away. And my mother was the strongest person that I've ever known.
Where was she found?
Follow me.
Seeing there's blood where the victim had slumped against the wall.
We also found these shell casings.
Wow, that's a lot.
Near the blood there are 7 expended casings. The first indicator of that is a rage killing. Dolores probably knows the person responsible for her demise. When you empty the gun, it's because you're angry. And angry speaks to motive.
I need to see her. I need to see her.
You can't come through there. You can't go through. It's okay. Let her through. I got her.
A 10-year-old girl shows up on the scene. She's visibly upset, more so than just somebody being shot and killed. Something's personal here.
What's your name?
Jill.
Okay, Jill. What's going on?
She says that she was playing next door in another friend's apartment when she heard loud pops. And she looked outside and she saw a crowd gathering, and then she saw an ambulance arrive.
I saw them putting the person on the stretcher, and then I saw it was my grandmom. I didn't know what to do, so I just waited for the police to come.
I'm very sorry you had to see that.
Is she okay?
Well, she's in the hospital right now. We're not sure yet.
We're in a situation where we need emotional support for her, and it's not here.
Is your mother here?
No, she's back in Washington. I was here visiting my grandmom for my birthday.
Do you have any other family that lives nearby?
Yes, my Aunt Mary.
Do you know her phone number?
I think so.
So I had one of my officers notify the aunt by telephone and advise her to meet this child at police headquarters.
Okay, Jill, this officer's going to take care of you till your aunt gets here. Thanks for being so brave.
As I watched the child being escorted out to a police car, I noticed that the old man I first saw when I got there is still in his lawn chair, still drinking a beer, and he nods his acknowledgement to me. And I thought that was a little odd. Let that thought pass and go back to what I'm doing.
Less than an hour later, Mary Labb, Jill's aunt, arrives at headquarters.
Baby, I'm so sorry. You must be so scared.
After they told me what happened, I just totally lost it.
Mary, Grandma's hurt. She's hurt bad.
I can imagine that was quite a shock for her to be with my mom that morning and then to have something like that happen to her.
Ma'am, I know you were giving information. Can I speak to you just for a minute before you go home?
Okay, you wait right here and then we'll go home.
She's able to tell us a little bit of the background of our victim. She says that her victim has lived in this apartment complex for a while and seemed to be loved by everybody.
She really loved her family, especially her grandkids. She just got her citizenship at age 65.
Mom was born in Trieste, Italy. She was in her 30s when she came to this country and was very determined in pretty much everything that she did.
Let's get you a bill.
Back at the crime scene,
Nobody seen or heard anything?
Kenda continues to search for clues leading to Dolores Wells' killer.
We're talking to all the residents in the building, and they all pretty much say that Dolores Wells was wonderful. She was everybody's grandmother.
Oh no, that's terrible.
She'd love to cook and cooked big meals for some of the residents. She would make cookies for the children that lived in the nearby complexes, and they describe her as a sweet little Italian grandmother who loved life. One resident said that he had heard that Dolores had argued with one of the other tenants in the building.
I don't know him, that typical angry old man.
He said he hangs around with another old guy, and they're both kind of mean old guys, and they sit in their lawn chairs and drink. So your thought returns to that man sitting in that lawn chair. He doesn't look upset. He's not distressed. He's unusual. It's not against the law to be unusual, but it's interesting to me when you're unusual 50 feet away from a dead woman.
Excuse me. I'm Detective Kenda.
He's apparently found a way to breed beer under his chair because he still has a beer.
Do you know anything about what happened here today?
You mean with Dolores?
That's right.
Yeah, it's real simple.
He turns and says,
I shot her.
I shot that bitch. Well, my. We're investigating the death of 64-year-old Dolores Wells, a beloved Italian grandmother shot to death in front of her apartment complex. And we've encountered a guy sitting in a lawn chair having a beer.
I'm sorry, what did you just say?
I said I shot that bitch.
There are people who falsely confess to crimes to gain attention. They are generally older. They are lonely.
What's your name?
James Chapman. Friends call me Jim. Once I got left.
It's also entirely possible he shot Dolores Wells 6 times in the chest.
All right, Mr. Chapman. If what you're saying is true, I'm going to have to place you under arrest. Stand up, put your hands behind your back.
The fact that he's an old man is meaningless. Policy dictates felony arrest requires handcuffs. For now, we own him.
Go ahead and put in a request for a search warrant for his apartment.
Okay, I'm on it.
I'm going to head back inside. There's someone I want to talk to.
To learn more about Jim Chapman, Kenda sits down with Jim's best friend, Case Oman.
Does Jim have any mental issues?
No, he's just mad at the world.
Mr. Oman explains that Jim's had 4 wives. He has 2 or 3 kids he doesn't really know, and a couple of grandkids. They're all back in Louisiana, and they don't like him, and he's very happy with that.
So how does he know Dolores Wells?
Funny thing, they used to be close.
When my mom first moved into that place, she would cook him dinners for him taking her to the store. He seemed like a nice man.
Unfortunately, he wanted to be more than friends, and she had no interest.
Look, Jim, we talked about this.
I don't understand, Dolores. What is it about me that you find so repellent?
Jim, I like you, just not in that way.
You just like the rest of them. You're an ungrateful bitch.
You need to leave! Get out!
Don't worry, I don't want nothing to do with ungrateful bitch like you anyway.
You're just a sad old man! Pathetic!
My mom had mentioned that he started butting into her life and bothering her. My mom would never back down. She would come back with something.
So what happened between the two of them today?
All I know is Jim and I were outside having a beer when Dolores comes walking by.
Mr. Ullman reports Dolores Wells comes out of her apartment with trash bags, and Jim Chapman glared at her.
Next thing I know, Jim gets up and walks away. He comes back. He had a gun in his pants pocket.
What's he gonna do? Oh my God, he's got a gun.
Dolores!
No!
And then he heard 5 or 6 gunshots.
With little doubt that Jim Chapman is the killer, Kenda heads back to the station to hear the full story from Jim himself.
We want as much knowledge as we can possibly have to present to a jury.
I've got some more questions for you, Mr. Chapman.
Let's just get this over with so I can go to jail and get a peaceful night's sleep for a change.
In a jail, Jim? Do you think it's peaceful in a jail?
So tell me what happened. Why did you decide to shoot Miss Wells?
That woman was evil. I just couldn't take it anymore.
Jim says that he and Dolores were oil and water. They never got along. Well, that's not what the witnesses said. He claims she spread rumors about him in the neighborhood, and she did all these terrible things, none of which were true.
It all started with that brat granddaughter of hers raising hell outside my apartment. Hey! Knock it off! Take that damn ball and get the hell out of here!
Chapman says when he did that, Dolores Wells came out of her apartment, looked at him, and said, "You cannot speak to my granddaughter like that."
You wonder your family won't talk to you! Go back in your room and drink yourself back to sleep!
Chapman says that he was furious. The longer he thought about it, the more angry he became with what Dolores had said to him.
A little later on, Dolores walks out, taking out the trash, and that's when Jim decided to go upstairs and get the gun.
Not only does he go get a gun, he makes certain the gun is loaded with a maximum number of bullets. The weapon will carry 6 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. Jim made sure that 7th round was in the chamber.
What Jim has told us so far clearly constitutes premeditated murder. He could have stopped at any time, but he took deliberate acts to execute what he wanted to do.
Dolores!
She came back from the dumpster, and he said, "I want you to keep your mouth shut about me."
Jim!
Dolores!
He said at that moment,
No!
he pulled the gun and shot her once. She fell to the ground stunned, and he felt he was sort of stunned too, but then he stepped forward and pumped the rest of the bullets into her body.
I remember my mom telling me they had had words in passing, but I
got no regrets. Got everything that was coming to her.
Oh, Jimmy, you need several psychiatrists. One's not going to be enough.
The search of Chapman's home provides the physical evidence to back up his confession.
We find a Jennings model J22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. It's pretty obvious that there's our murder weapon.
Jim Chapman is convicted of first-degree murder.
Friday, September 17, 2021. London was moving through another ordinary September evening. People were finishing work. Trains were carrying commuters home. Cars rolled through the streets of southeast London beneath the fading light. In homes and apartments across the city, dinner was being prepared, television screens were glowing, messages were being exchanged, and people were making plans for the weekend. Nothing about that evening appeared extraordinary. Nothing said a young primary school teacher would become known across Britain. Her name was Sabina Nessa. She was 28 years old. She was a teacher. And on that evening, she was simply walking to meet a friend. It was not supposed to be a dangerous journey. It was not an unfamiliar expedition into an isolated part of the country. She was not traveling hundreds of miles away. She was moving through an area she knew, in southeast London, not far from home. The destination was close enough that walking was perfectly ordinary. At approximately 8:30 in the evening, Sabina left her home in Kidbrooke. She stepped outside and began walking. That simple decision would become the final known journey of her life. At some point during those minutes, the ordinary world around her continued exactly as it always had. Lights remained on in nearby houses. Vehicles passed along roads. Other people went about their evening routines. And somewhere along the route, Sabina entered Cater Park. The park was not a place that existed outside civilization. It was part of the neighborhood. A green space surrounded by the city, a place through which people could walk as they traveled between nearby streets. But that night, someone else was there. A man years old. He lived in Eastbourne, in East Sussex, and worked at a garage. Sabina did not know him. There was no known personal relationship between them. There was no history of an argument between them, no known financial dispute, no romantic connection, no feud that could explain why their paths would cross. They were strangers. And yet, in the darkness of that September evening, their paths crossed. That is one of the most disturbing elements of Sabina Nessa's story. She did not walk into a confrontation she had created. She did not knowingly meet a dangerous person. She did not know that the man somewhere in that area represented a threat to her life. She was simply walking. And somewhere inside that ordinary journey, the invisible line between an everyday evening and a nightmare was crossed. Later, investigators would reconstruct those final moments through CCTV footage. The cameras would become silent witnesses to a crime that no human being had seen clearly enough to stop. They would help investigators understand where Sabina had walked. They would help establish the movements of the man who approached her. They would help transform a seemingly impossible mystery into a sequence of events. But CCTV could not intervene. It could reveal. It could not save her. According to the evidence presented in court, Selimai had traveled from Eastbourne to London that day. Prosecutors argued that his actions before the killing indicated preparation rather than a spontaneous confrontation. He had been moving through the city looking for an opportunity to attack a woman. And then Sabina appeared. There is something deeply unsettling about the randomness contained within that moment. Imagine a city of millions of people. Thousands of streets. Hundreds of parks. Countless journeys beginning and ending every evening. And among all those people, one woman happened to walk through one particular place at one particular time. Sabina became the person whose path crossed his. The danger was invisible to her. She could not see the future. She could not know that the man somewhere nearby was watching the environment around him. She could not know that her name would soon become part of a murder investigation. She could not know that the walk she had begun at around 8:30 that evening would be the last journey she would ever make. The next moments would be violent. According to the evidence later presented at court, Selimai approached Sabina from behind. The attack was sudden. There was no means to understand what was happening before she was assaulted. She was struck repeatedly with a heavy metal traffic object. The court heard that she was hit 34 times. 34. The number is difficult to comprehend without stopping to consider what it means. It was not a single blow in the heat of an argument. It was a sustained act of violence against a woman who had been walking alone. The attack continued until Sabina was incapacitated. She was then dragged towards another area nearby. And eventually, she was strangled. Her life ended in the same general area through which she had been walking only moments earlier. The city continued around her. The evening continued. But for Sabina, time had stopped. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of that park, the people who loved her still believed she was alive. That is what makes the hours immediately following a disappearance so different from what comes later. At first, there is uncertainty. Someone has not arrived. A message has not been answered. A phone call goes unanswered. Perhaps the person is delayed. Perhaps the battery has died. Perhaps there has been some innocent explanation. The human mind searches for ordinary answers because ordinary aren't to meet a friend. She did not arrive. As the hours passed, concern grew. But there was no immediate understanding of what had happened in Cater Park. No one standing outside her home could see what had happened in the darkness. No one could rewind the evening. No one could walk back through the minutes and stop the attack before it happened. The following day, September 18th, the terrible truth began to emerge. A member of the public discovered Sabina's body in Cater Park, near the One Space Community Center. Her body had been partially concealed by grass and vegetation. Police were called. The area was secured. And what had initially been a missing person concern became something far more devastating. A young woman had been murdered. The investigation began almost immediately. But before investigators could identify a killer, they first had to answer a much more basic question. What had happened to Sabina after she left home? That question would take detectives into the park, into the surrounding streets, into hours of CCTV footage and eventually toward a man whose movements had been captured by cameras. The investigators began reconstructing the final journey. They needed to know when Sabina left. They needed to know which route anyone who had been near her. They needed to establish who had entered the park and who had left it. Every minute mattered. Every image mattered. Every unfamiliar figure in the background could potentially become important. London's extensive network of surveillance cameras meant that Sabina's final journey had not disappeared completely into the darkness. It had been recorded in fragments. A person walking here. A vehicle moving there. A figure appearing in one camera and disappearing from another. Piece by piece, investigators began assembling a visual timeline. And then a man emerged from that timeline. Koki Selamai. His presence was not initially known to Sabina's family. He was not someone detectives had expected to find. He was not connected to her through a visible personal history. He was simply a stranger who appeared in the investigation. But the more investigators examined his movements, the more important he became. The cameras did not merely place him in the general area. They helped detectives reconstruct what he had been doing before the attack. The picture that emerged was disturbing. According to the prosecution's case, Selamai had not simply encountered Sabina by accident and reacted violently to an argument, with the intention of finding a woman to attack. If that interpretation was correct, then the murder was not the sudden explosion of a disagreement. It was something colder. Something that had been developing before Sabina ever knew his name. And this created the central question that would haunt the investigation. Why Sabina? Why this woman? Why that evening? Why that path? There was no known relationship between them. No evidence of a personal grudge. No obvious reason for him to know who she was. She had simply been there. That possibility is perhaps the most frightening aspect of the entire case. Because if Sabina had been targeted by someone she knew, there would at least be a story connecting the two people. A disagreement. A history. A motive. Something that could be examined. Something that could be explained. But when the victim and offender are strangers, the world becomes much more frightening. The victim may have done nothing to provoke the attack. She may not even have known that the danger existed. She can simply become the person who happens to cross the path of someone who has already decided to commit violence. And Sabina's story would force an entire country to confront The fear of walking alone. The fear that a familiar park can become a crime scene. The fear that an ordinary evening can become the last evening of a person's life. Yet there was another side to Sabina's story, one that could easily disappear beneath the horror of the crime. She was not born to become a name in a murder case. She was not a symbol. She was not a headline. Before September 17, 2021, she was simply Sabina. A daughter. A sister. A friend. A teacher. Someone whose presence mattered to people who knew her. At Rushy Green Primary School in Catford, she taught Year 1 pupils. Her working life was built around children who were still at the beginning of their education, children who depended on adults to guide them through their earliest years at school. For them, their teacher was not an abstract figure. She was part of their everyday world. And then, in a single night, that world changed. The person who had left home to meet a friend never arrived. The person whose students expected to see again would not return to the classroom. And the family waiting for answers would soon be forced to confront a reality that no family should ever have to face. But on that first night, none of that. The unanswered questions. The search. The uncertainty. And somewhere in the background, CCTV cameras were holding fragments of the truth. The investigators did not yet know everything. The public did not yet know the name of the man responsible. Sabina's family did not yet have the complete story. But the evidence was already there. It was hidden inside images captured by cameras. It was waiting in the movements of a stranger. It was waiting in the route Sabina had taken. It was waiting in the park where her final journey had ended. And as detectives began following those fragments, one fact would become impossible to ignore. The person responsible had not simply vanished into the night. He had left traces. And those traces would eventually lead investigators away from the quiet paths of Cater Park and toward Eastbourne. Toward a man named Koki Selamai. The question would no longer be whether Sabina had been murdered. She had. The question would become whether the man whose movements had been captured by the city's cameras was the person responsible. And if he was, investigators would have to understand something even more disturbing. What had brought him to London that night? What had he been looking for? Simply been the woman who happened to walk into his path? And what could possibly explain the violence inflicted upon a woman who had done nothing more than leave her home for an ordinary evening with a friend? Those questions would eventually reach a courtroom. But before they reached the courtroom, detectives had to reconstruct a night that had begun with something so ordinary that nobody could have imagined where it would end. A young teacher walking through her neighborhood. A man moving through the city. A park beneath the September night. A meeting that should never have happened. And a trail of silent images that would become the first witness to the murder of Sabina Nessa. Because sometimes, the most terrifying stories do not begin with a scream. They begin with a woman closing the door of her home, stepping into the evening, and believing she will be back. Sabina Nessa believed she was simply going to meet a friend. She never made it. And the story of what happened between those 2 points would become one of the most haunting murder investigations in modern London. On the evening of September 17, 2021, London was doing what London had done countless times before. People were leaving work. Trains were carrying passengers toward home. Restaurants were filling. Cars moved through the streets of southeast London beneath the ordinary conversations were taking place. Someone was making dinner. Someone was checking their phone. Someone was deciding whether to stay in or go out. And in Kidbrooke, a 28-year-old primary school teacher named Sabina Nessa was getting ready to leave her home. She had somewhere to be. Someone was waiting for her. It was not an unusual journey. It was not a long journey. It was not a trip into an unknown part of the city. Sabina was simply going to meet a friend at a nearby bar. At around 8:30 that evening, she stepped outside. She began walking. There was no reason for anyone watching her to think that anything was wrong. No reason to imagine that this would be the last time Sabina would ever leave her home. No reason to believe that, within minutes, she would encounter a stranger who would change the lives of everyone who loved her. Sabina did not know his name. She had never met him. There was no known argument between them, no personal history, no relationship that could explain what was about to happen. His name was Koki Selamai. He was 36 years old and lived in Eastbourne, in East Sussex. He worked at a garage. And on that particular day, according to evidence later presented in court, he had travelled to London. Two strangers were moving through the same small part of a city of millions. That coincidence would become fatal. Cater Park was not some remote wilderness. It was part of the neighbourhood. People walked through it. People passed through the surrounding streets. It was simply part of the landscape of everyday life in southeast London. And that is what makes the story so difficult to understand. There was nothing about Sabina's evening that should have placed her in extraordinary danger. She was not searching for trouble. She was not involved in an argument. She was not meeting a stranger. She was simply walking. But somewhere in that park, another person was looking for an opportunity. The evidence would later show that Selamai had been moving through London before encountering Sabina. Prosecutors would argue that his actions indicated preparation and a predatory intention rather than an accidental confrontation. And then Sabina appeared. The difference between the two people could hardly have been greater. One was simply trying to reach a friend. The other, according to the prosecution's case, had come looking for a woman to attack. Sabina could not have known any of this. She could not see the intentions inside another person's mind. She could not look ahead and wreck a final one. She continued walking. Then the distance between the two strangers began to disappear. What happened next was sudden and brutal. According to evidence presented at the Old Bailey, Selamai attacked Sabina from behind. She was struck repeatedly with a heavy metal traffic object. The court heard that she was hit 34 times. 34 blows. The number alone is almost impossible to absorb. But the significance of that number is not simply the violence contained within it. It tells us something about the nature of the attack. This was not a brief confrontation that ended after a single moment of panic. It was prolonged violence directed at a woman who had been walking through a familiar neighborhood. Sabina was eventually incapacitated. Selamai then dragged her towards another area nearby. The attack continued. And finally, Sabina was strangled. Her life ended in the park while the city around her continued moving. That is one of the cruelest features of a murder committed in a city. The world does not stop. Cars continue to pass. Windows remain illuminated. People continue talking. Somewhere, a person laughs without knowing what has happened only streets away, walks home. Someone looks at the clock. And somewhere in Cater Park, a young woman who had left home expecting to meet a friend is no longer alive. Yet the people who loved Sabina did not know that. Not immediately. For them, the night did not begin with the discovery of a murder. It began with waiting. Waiting for a message. Waiting for a phone call. Waiting for Sabina to arrive. Perhaps she was delayed. Perhaps she had stopped somewhere. Perhaps her phone battery had died. Perhaps there was some ordinary explanation. Those are the thoughts people have when someone does not arrive on time. The human mind naturally reaches for harmless explanations before it accepts catastrophe. But Sabina would never reach the bar. She would never meet her friend. And she would never walk back through the streets of Kidbrooke. The following day, September 18th, the terrible truth was discovered. A member of the public found Sabina's body in Cater Park, near the One Space Community Centre. She had been partially concealed by grass and vegetation. Police arrived. The area was secured. A crime scene began to form around the place where, only hours earlier, an ordinary evening had turned into murder. Done this. But answering that question required detectives to reconstruct the hours before Sabina's death. They needed to know exactly where she had gone. They needed to know which route she had taken. They needed to know who else had been in the area. They needed to know whether anyone had seen her. And they needed to find the person who had approached her in the darkness. Fortunately, there were cameras. London's surveillance network had captured fragments of the evening. Not everything. Not every second. But enough. A figure could be seen. Movements could be traced. Routes could be reconstructed. A timeline could begin to take shape. For investigators, CCTV became something more than security footage. It became a witness. A witness that could not speak. A witness that could not describe what it had seen. A witness that had no emotion and no memory in the human sense. But it had recorded movement. And movement could be followed. Detectives began working backwards. They traced Sabina's final journey. They examined the people who appeared nearby. They looked at vehicles. They followed unfamiliar figures. And eventually, one man began to emerge. The stranger who had crossed paths with Sabina. The man whose movements would become central to the investigation. As investigators reconstructed his journey, the case became more disturbing. Because the evidence suggested that Selimai had not simply stumbled into Cater Park and reacted to a chance disagreement. There had been activity before the attack. There had been movement. There had been preparation. And prosecutors would later argue that he had traveled to London with the intention of finding a woman to attack. If that was true, then Sabina's death had begun before Sabina ever entered the park. The crime had already been set in motion. She simply became the person who crossed his path. And that possibility created one question that would remain at the heart of the case. Why her? Why Sabina? Why that particular woman? There was no known personal connection. No evidence that Selimai had known her. No history between them. No financial dispute. No romantic relationship. No revenge. No argument that had suddenly turned violent. Sabina was a stranger. That fact changes the way we look at the crime. When someone is killed by a person they know, investigators, who was angry? Who had something to gain? Who had been threatened? Who had been betrayed? Who had a reason to want the victim gone? But Sabina's case offered none of those obvious answers. There was no relationship to unravel. There was only a stranger and a woman who happened to be walking through the same place at the same time. That randomness is frightening. Because it suggests that Sabina did not need to make a mistake to become a victim. She did not need to know the wrong person. She did not need to enter a dangerous situation knowingly. She only needed to be there. And that is why the story of Sabina Nessa would resonate far beyond the boundaries of Cater Park. Her death forced people to think about the simple journeys they made every day. The walk home from work. The walk to a friend's house. The shortcut through a park. The familiar road taken hundreds of times. The assumption that because a place is familiar, it must be safe. Sabina was in a place she knew. She was close to home. She was going to see someone she knew. And yet she encountered someone who had no place in her life until the moment he entered it with violence. The tragedy is that Sabina's life had been so much larger than the final minutes that would eventually define. At Rushy Green Primary School in Catford, she taught Year 1 children. For those children, she was not a name on a news report. She was their teacher. The adult standing in front of them in the classroom. The person helping them learn. The person whose face belonged to the familiar world of school. She had a profession. She had family. She had friends. She had plans. She had a future that, until that September evening, appeared to be continuing normally. Then she walked through Cater Park. And everything stopped. For her family, the days that followed would become a painful search for answers. For detectives, they would become an enormous reconstruction of movements, times, and locations. For the public, the case would become another reminder of how vulnerable a person can be while simply trying to get home. And for the investigators, the cameras offered something precious. A trail. The killer had not disappeared completely. He had moved through a city filled with cameras. Every appearance created another fragment. Every fragment could be connected to another. Every connection could establish a timeline. And a timeline could lead to a suspect. Eventually, investigators from the CCTV images now had a name. The name now had an address. and the investigation began moving rapidly toward him. But identifying a suspect was only the beginning. Detectives still had to determine what had happened. They had to establish whether Selimay had planned the attack. They had to understand what he had been doing before arriving in London. They had to examine his behavior. They had to examine his relationship with women in his past. They had to determine whether the violence against Sabina was an isolated act or another expression of something that had already appeared elsewhere. And above all, they had to confront the question that would eventually be placed before a judge. Was this murder the result of a sudden moment of violence? Or had Selimay gone out that night already looking for someone to hurt? The evidence presented later in court would point toward the second possibility. Prosecutors argued that Selimay had traveled to London with a predatory purpose. His actions earlier that day would become part of the prosecution's attempt to understand his state of mind. He had encountered his former partner. There had been a failed attempt to initiate sexual activity. He later went to a hotel in Eastbourne where she had worked. There was a dispute concerning themselves, explained Sabina's murder. They did not provide a simple equation in which one event automatically produced another. But they became pieces of a larger picture. A picture of a man whose behavior, according to the prosecution, was becoming increasingly focused on sexual frustration, control, and violence. There was also evidence of previous violence toward a woman who had been his partner. At one point, he had placed his hands around her neck. That detail would later carry a chilling significance because strangulation was ultimately how Sabina died. But even these details could not answer the most painful question. Why did Sabina have to be the person he encountered? There would be no satisfying answer. No explanation capable of making the crime make sense. No hidden connection that could transform a random killing into something understandable. And perhaps that is one of the hardest truths in cases like this. Sometimes the victim did nothing wrong. Sometimes there is no secret mistake to uncover. Sometimes there is no warning that the victim could have recognized. Sometimes there is simply a dangerous person who makes a decision, and an innocent person who happens to cross his path. Sabina's family would eventually hear the evidence. Hear how investigators had followed the killer. They would hear about the CCTV. They would hear about the man responsible. But knowing who killed her could never restore the life that had been taken. The investigation would eventually lead to court. Selimay would first refuse to plead guilty to murder, although he accepted responsibility for causing Sabina's death. Then, on February 25, 2022, at the beginning of the expected trial, he changed his plea. He admitted murder. The courtroom no longer needed to hear a full trial proving what had happened. The man responsible had finally accepted the legal reality of what he had done. But a guilty plea could not answer everything. It could not explain why. It could not erase the CCTV images. It could not return Sabina to her classroom. It could not give her family back the future they had expected to share with her. And it could not undo that final walk through Cater Park. On April 8, 2022, Koki Selimay was sentenced at the Old Bailey. He received a life sentence with a minimum term of 36 years before parole could be considered. The sentence closed the legal chapter of the case. But justice and closure are not always the same thing. A court can impose a sentence. A prison can hold a killer. But none of those things can answer the question that remains inside a grieving family. Why? Why did a young teacher leave home one Friday evening expecting nothing more than a short walk and a meeting with a friend, only to become the victim of a stranger's violence? Why did the person responsible decide that another human being could become an object for his anger, frustration, or desire? And why did that ordinary September evening have to end the way it did? There are questions in true crime that investigators can answer. Where did the killer go? When did the attack happen? How did the police identify him? What evidence connected him to the crime? What did the court decide? But some questions remain beyond the reach of evidence. The most important of them can be only two words. Why her? Sabina Nessa had no way of knowing that the person she would encounter in Cater Park was dangerous. She had no reason to believe that a normal walk could become a life-or-death situation. She could not know that the city around her was about to become the final setting of her life. She could not know that cameras would later reconstruct her final journey. She could not know that investigators would follow those images to a month later, that man would stand in the Old Bailey and admit to her murder. All she knew that evening was where she was going. She was going to meet a friend. That was all. And that is where this story truly begins. Not with a courtroom. Not with a prison sentence. Not with a confession. But with a young woman leaving home on an ordinary Friday night, believing that she would return. She never did. And as detectives began to reconstruct every step of her final journey, they would discover that the answer to her murder had been moving through the same darkness. A stranger. A plan. A park. A trail of silent cameras. And a life that should have continued long after September 17, 2021. The city had recorded the movements. The evidence would eventually reveal the killer. The court would eventually deliver justice. But before any of that happened, there was only Sabina. A 28-year-old teacher. A daughter. A friend. A woman walking home through a place she knew. And a final journey that should have ended at a friend's table, with an ordinary conversation and another ordinary night. Instead, it ended in Cater Park. And the question: how could something so ordinary become so terribly irreversible? There are moments in life that feel so ordinary that we never think to remember them. A door closing behind us. A phone being placed inside a pocket. A pair of shoes stepping onto a familiar pavement. A short walk through a neighborhood we have crossed hundreds of times before. We do these things without thinking because ordinary life depends on the belief that tomorrow will look much like today. On Friday, September 17, 2021, Sabina Nessa had every reason to believe that. She was 28 years old. She was a primary school teacher. She had a home in Kidbrooke, in southeast London, a profession she cared about, people who loved her, and an evening ahead of her that appeared completely unremarkable. There was nothing about that Friday night that should have become a final chapter. There was no warning. No message from the future. No voice telling her to stay home. No sign that the route she was about to take would become the last route of her life. At approximately 8:30 in the evening, Sabina left her home. She was going to meet a friend at a nearby bar. The journey was short. Short enough to walk. Familiar enough to feel routine. And perhaps that end. Sabina was not embarking on an adventure. She was not traveling to a distant city. She was not knowingly entering a dangerous place. She was simply walking. The evening had begun like thousands of other evenings in London. As the daylight faded, the streets of southeast London settled into the familiar rhythm of night. Windows glowed from inside homes. Vehicles moved through nearby roads. People went about their private lives, unaware that something terrible was unfolding only a short distance away. Sabina continued toward Cater Park. She did not know that another person was there. She did not know his name. She did not know where he had come from. And she had no reason to imagine that he was looking for an opportunity to hurt someone. His name was Koki Selamai. He was 36 years old. He lived in Eastbourne, East Sussex, and worked at a garage. He was not part of Sabina's world. There was no known relationship connecting the two. No friendship. No romance. No business dispute. No family connection. No history of conflict. To Sabina, he was simply a stranger. And that stranger was about to become the last person she would ever tell a courtroom that Selamai had travelled from Eastbourne to London that day. They would argue that his movements before the killing showed preparation and a predatory purpose. But Sabina did not know any of that. She could not see intention. She could only see the path ahead. Perhaps the park looked completely normal. Perhaps the familiar surroundings gave her no reason to feel afraid. That is the cruel thing about danger. It rarely announces itself. A dangerous person does not always look dangerous. A terrible decision does not always begin with a dramatic moment. Sometimes violence begins while everything around it still looks completely ordinary. A woman walks. A man watches. The distance between them closes. And nobody else knows. The evidence later presented in court would show that Selimai approached Sabina from behind. The attack was sudden. There was no meaningful opportunity for her to understand what was happening before the violence began. She was struck repeatedly with a heavy metal traffic object. The court heard that she was hit 34 times. 34 times. The number is difficult to absorb because behind every number is a human moment. A person trying to survive. A person whose ordinary evening had suddenly become something incomprehensible. The attack continued until Sabina was incapacitated. She was then dragged toward another area nearby. And eventually, she was strangled. The woman who had left her home only a short time earlier was dead. The place where she died was not some distant wilderness. It was a part of the city. A place surrounded by the ordinary world. And while Sabina's life was ending, London continued around her. That contrast is almost impossible to escape. The city does not stop for one person's tragedy. Somewhere nearby, people were still walking. Cars were still moving. Lights were still burning in houses. Phones were still ringing. Someone was probably laughing. Someone was probably making plans for the weekend. And somewhere inside that same city, a family had no idea that their daughter, sister, and friend would never come home. For Sabina's loved ones, the first hours would not begin with certainty. They would begin with questions. Where is she? Why hasn't she arrived? Why hasn't she called? Why hasn't she answered? When someone is late, the human mind searches for harmless explanations. Battery had died. Maybe she stopped somewhere. Maybe she had become distracted. Maybe she would walk through the door at any moment. But Sabina would not walk through that door. She would not reach the bar. She would not meet her friend. She would not return home. The following day, September 18th, the truth emerged. A member of the public discovered Sabina's body in Cater Park, near the One Space Community Center. Her body was partially concealed by grass and vegetation. The discovery transformed uncertainty into horror. Police were called. The area was secured. And the place where Sabina's final journey had ended became a crime scene. For investigators, the first hours were about preserving what remained. For her family, they were about trying to understand something that no family should ever have to understand. A young woman had gone out for an ordinary evening. She had not come back. And now she was dead. The question was no longer where Sabina was. The question was who had killed her. Detectives began reconstructing her final movements. They needed to know exactly where she had gone after leaving home. They needed to know what route she had taken. They needed to know who had been in the area, and they needed to discover whether the killer had left anything behind. But there was another witness. One that could not speak. One that could not be frightened. One that could not forget. CCTV. London's network of surveillance cameras had captured fragments of the evening. Not every moment. Not every angle. But enough to begin building a story. Investigators could follow movement. They could compare times. They could examine figures appearing in different locations. They could begin reconstructing a sequence that no human witness had been able to provide. A journey that had disappeared into the darkness could now be viewed frame by frame. Sabina leaving home. Sabina moving through the area. People appearing around her. And then another figure. A man. A stranger. His movements began attracting attention. The investigation slowly moved toward Koki Selimai. At first, a name is only a name. Then a name becomes a person. A person becomes a suspect. And a suspect becomes the center of an investigation that will eventually determine whether the evidence can withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. But the more investigators examined Selimai, the prosecution would later argue that his actions were not those of a man who had simply lost control during an unexpected argument. They argued that he had traveled to London looking for a woman to attack. If that was true, then the murder had begun before Sabina ever saw him. The decision had already been made. The intention already existed. All that remained was for him to find someone. And then Sabina walked into his path. That possibility changes everything. Because it means Sabina may not have been killed because of anything she did. She may not have been targeted because of who she was. She may simply have been there. At the wrong place. At the wrong time. In front of the wrong man. That is one of the most disturbing realities of random violence. There is often no warning because there is no relationship. There is no argument to remember. No suspicious message. No threatening phone call. No history that tells the victim she is in danger. The victim does not know the offender. And the offender may know nothing about the victim. He only sees an opportunity. That is what made Sabina's death so deeply unsettling. She was not living a dangerous life. She was not seeking out risk. She worked with young children. She had built a life around education and the people she cared about. At Rushy Green Primary School in Catford, she taught Year 1. To the children in her classroom, she was not a murder victim. She was their teacher. The familiar adult who stood in front of them. The person who helped them learn. The person they expected to see again. That is why the news of her death could never be reduced to the description of a crime scene. Behind the police tape was a human life. Behind the investigation was a family. Behind the photographs and CCTV footage was a woman whose life had existed long before the night she was murdered. She had memories. She had relationships. She had hopes. She had ordinary plans for an ordinary future. And all of that was taken from her in minutes. Yet the investigation was only beginning. The police now had to move from the place where Sabina had been found to the person who had put her there. The cameras provided a trail. The trail led investigators toward Eastbourne. And eventually, the man they had been searching for was identified. Koki Selamai. But identifying him was not enough. The detectives still needed to understand what had brought him to London. Why had he traveled there? What had he been doing that day? Was Sabina selected in advance? Or had she simply been the woman who appeared at the moment he was looking for a victim? And perhaps most importantly, what was happening inside the mind of a man who could look at a complete stranger and decide that her life was worth nothing? The answers would emerge slowly. Some would come from CCTV. Some would come from evidence gathered by investigators. Some would come from the events surrounding Selamai before the murder. And some questions would remain unanswered. Because even after a killer is identified, even after a confession is made, even after a judge delivers a sentence, there are certain questions that evidence cannot completely resolve. Why her? Why that night? Why that park? Why did a simple walk to meet a friend end in murder? Those questions would follow the case all the way to the Old Bailey. Before that happened, however, detectives would uncover more about Selamai's behavior on the day of the murder. The prosecution would point to events involving his former partner. They would describe an unsuccessful attempt to initiate sexual activity. They would describe his subsequent visit to a hotel in Eastbourne where she had payment. These events would become part of the prosecution's effort to understand the circumstances surrounding his behavior before he traveled to London. They did not provide a simple explanation. They did not make the murder understandable. But they formed part of a disturbing sequence. There was also evidence that Selamai had previously behaved violently toward a woman who had been his partner. At one point, he had placed his hands around her neck. Years later, that detail would take on an especially chilling meaning. Because Sabina's life had ended through strangulation. Yet even knowing all of this, one question remained. Why Sabina? There was no known connection between them. No personal revenge. No relationship. No financial motive. No history that could explain why her. And perhaps that is why the case is so haunting. Because the absence of a relationship means there is no comforting explanation waiting underneath the evidence. There is no secret story that makes the murder suddenly logical. There is simply a woman who was walking through her neighborhood and a man who, according to the prosecution, was searching for an opportunity to commit violence. That is a terrifying thought. Because it means the tragedy did not depend on someone else making the wrong choice. A choice that Sabina had no control over. A choice that she could not anticipate. A choice that ended her life. Months later, the case would reach the courtroom. Selimai initially refused to plead guilty to murder, although he accepted responsibility for causing Sabina's death. A full trial was expected. The evidence would have been examined. The CCTV would have been scrutinized. The prosecution would have presented its reconstruction. The defense would have responded. And Sabina's family would have been forced to listen to the details of the final moments of her life. But on February 25, 2022, at the beginning of the expected trial, Selimai changed his plea. He admitted murder. The courtroom no longer needed a full trial to determine whether he was responsible. The legal question had been answered. But there was another question that a guilty plea could never answer. Why? A confession can establish responsibility. It cannot restore a life. A sentence can establish punishment. It cannot return a daughter to her family. A prison can hold a killer. It cannot reopen a classroom door and bring back the teacher the children were expected to. Selimai was sentenced at the Old Bailey to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 36 years before parole could be considered. The law had reached its conclusion. But Sabina's story did not end there. Because the end of a trial is not necessarily the end of grief. For the people who loved Sabina, there would still be mornings when her absence was impossible to ignore. There would still be memories. There would still be photographs. There would still be the knowledge that a simple Friday evening had become the dividing line between the life they knew and the life that followed. And somewhere in those memories would remain the image of Sabina leaving home at approximately 8:30 that night. Perhaps she was thinking about the friend she was about to meet. Perhaps she was thinking about work. Perhaps she was thinking about something completely ordinary. We cannot know. What we do know is that she had no reason to believe she was walking toward danger. She could not see what was waiting in Cater Park. She could not know that a stranger had traveled from Eastbourne. She could not know that his movements would later be reconstructed by detectives. She could not know that the cameras around London would become silent witnesses to her final journey. She could not know that her death would trigger a nationwide conversation about women's safety far beyond the streets of Kidbrooke. She was simply Sabina. A 28-year-old teacher. A woman going to meet a friend. A person who expected to come home. And that is where the tragedy becomes most difficult to accept. The final chapter of Sabina's life did not begin with a warning. It began with an ordinary decision. She opened the door. She stepped outside. She started walking. The city was still alive around her. And then, somewhere in the darkness, she encountered the man who would kill her. The rest of the story would be told through evidence. Through CCTV. Through police investigation. Through courtroom testimony. Through the words and actions of the man responsible. But before the cameras, before the arrest, before the courtroom, there was only one thing that mattered. Sabina was alive. And then she was not. A short journey had become a murder. A familiar park had become a crime scene. A stranger had become a killer. And a family had lost someone they could never replace. The investigation would soon begin pulling apart the final hours of Sabina's life. Every movement. Every location. Every image. Every trail, they would discover that the man responsible had left more behind than a body in a park. He had left a pattern. He had left evidence. And he had left behind a trail that would eventually lead directly to him. The question was no longer whether Sabina had been murdered. The answer was already written into the crime scene. The question was who had done it. And as the investigation turned toward Eastbourne, the silent images from London were about to tell detectives exactly where to look. Southeast London is a place where millions of ordinary lives exist almost on top of one another. Terraced houses stand beside apartment blocks. Busy roads run past quiet residential streets. Trains move through stations carrying people who may never know the names of the passengers sitting beside them. Shops close for the night. Office workers return home. Children sleep behind bedroom windows while the city outside continues moving. Kidbrooke is part of that landscape. It is not a place that immediately suggests danger. It is a residential part of southeast London, a place where people live, work, raise families and travel through familiar routes every day. For someone who lives there, the streets are not a collection of locations on a map. They are landmarks. Remember, you turn. A road you cross. A path that saves several minutes. A park that connects one part of the neighborhood to another. For Sabina Nessa, this was home. And on the evening of September 17, 2021, the ordinary familiarity of that environment would become one of the most important elements in understanding what happened to her. She left home at approximately 8:30 p.m. The destination was nearby. She was going to meet a friend at a bar. There was no long journey ahead of her. No complicated route requiring public transportation. No reason for her to believe she was stepping into an unfamiliar environment. She simply needed to walk. That distinction matters. Because when we look backward at a tragedy, there is always a temptation to search for the moment when the victim should have known something was wrong. We look for the warning sign that was missed, the decision that could have been different, the moment when everything might have been prevented. But sometimes there is no such moment. Sabina's journey was ordinary. That is precisely why the setting matters. Cater Park was part of the neighborhood through which she was traveling. It was not a distant wilderness or a place completely removed from the city. It existed within the fabric of everyday London, of people living nearby. For Sabina, walking through that area did not represent an extraordinary decision. It was simply a way of getting from one place to another. The September evening was gradually becoming night. The light was fading. The familiar landscape was beginning to change character as darkness settled across the park and the surrounding streets. During daylight hours, a green space can feel open and transparent. Paths are visible. Trees and buildings form recognizable shapes. Other people can be seen at a distance. After dark, those same spaces become different. Distances are harder to judge. A person standing farther away can disappear into shadow. A familiar path can suddenly feel much longer. And the human eye can only see what the available light allows it to see. Sabina continued walking. Somewhere else in London, people were beginning their own Friday nights. For some, the weekend was starting. For others, it was simply another working day ending. The city had no knowledge of what was about to happen. That is one of the most haunting features of the setting. The location of a murder does not necessarily look like a crime scene before the crime occurs. The pavement does not carry a warning, is waiting nearby. A park does not become frightening until after someone has been harmed there. Before that, it is simply a park. And that night, Cater Park was exactly that. A familiar green space within a busy city. A place people could walk through. A place that connected the surrounding neighborhood. A place that, by the following morning, would be surrounded by police tape. The transformation would be almost impossible to comprehend. One evening, people could move through the area without thinking about it. The next day, investigators would be examining the ground for evidence. Police officers would control access. Questions would replace routine. The ordinary geography of the neighborhood would become part of a murder investigation. Every path mattered. Every entrance and exit mattered. Every nearby camera mattered. Every person who had passed through the area might potentially matter. But at 8:30 that Friday evening, none of those things were visible. Sabina was simply walking toward her destination. And somewhere else, Koki Selamai was moving through London. He was 36 years old. He lived in Eastbourne, East Sussex. He worked at a garage. And according to the Eastbourne to London on the day of the murder. That fact would eventually become central to the prosecution's case. Because the distance between Eastbourne and southeast London meant that Selimai had not simply been a local resident who happened to encounter Sabina during his normal routine. He had travelled. He had crossed from one part of southeast England into London. And investigators would later examine what had happened before he entered Cater Park. The answer would help prosecutors construct a picture of his state of mind. Earlier that day, Selimai had encountered his former partner. According to evidence presented during the proceedings, he had attempted to initiate sexual activity with her, but the attempt was unsuccessful. He later went to a hotel in Eastbourne where she had worked. There was a dispute concerning payment. On their own, those events did not explain a murder. Human behavior is rarely that simple. A difficult encounter does not automatically create a killer. Anger does not automatically become murder. Frustration does not automatically become violence. But in a criminal investigation, events are examined in sequence. Investigators and prosecutors ask what happened first, what happened next, and whether the individual events form a meaningful in Selimai's case. The prosecution argued that his journey to London was not merely an ordinary trip. They argued that he had gone there looking for a woman to attack. If that argument was correct, then the setting of Cater Park was not merely where a spontaneous confrontation occurred. It was the place where a predatory search finally encountered a victim. And Sabina became that victim. The difference between those two interpretations is enormous. In one version, violence erupts unexpectedly. In the other, violence is already present in the mind of the offender before the victim ever appears. The victim does not create the danger. She merely enters its path. That was the argument prosecutors would eventually put before the court. But on the night itself, there was no courtroom. There were no lawyers. There were no photographs displayed as evidence. There were no detectives explaining the timeline. There was only a woman walking through a neighborhood she knew. And a man moving through the same city. The city itself would become an enormous puzzle. London is filled with cameras. Traffic cameras. Security cameras. Cameras outside businesses. Cameras covering roads and public spaces. Not every angle is clear. Not every image provides an answer. But collectively, they can create something investigators desperately need after a crime. A timeline. A person can disappear from one camera and appear on another. A vehicle can be followed from one street to the next. A suspect can be seen approaching an area and later leaving it. A seemingly meaningless figure in the background can suddenly become the most important person in an investigation. For Sabina's case, CCTV would eventually play a critical role. But before investigators could use those images, Sabina first had to disappear. And that is where the geography of the case becomes painfully important. She was not lost. She was not wandering. She was not attempting to disappear. She was walking to meet someone. At some point, she entered Cater Park. The path ahead appeared to be part of an ordinary journey. But the person responsible for her death was also there. The attack that followed would happen quickly. According to the evidence later presented at court, Selimai approached her from behind. Sabina had no known relationship with him. She had no reason to expect an attack. She could not have known what was about to happen because it was familiar. That is one of the uncomfortable truths exposed by the case. Familiarity is not the same thing as safety. A place can feel safe because we know it. We recognize its roads. We know where the entrances are. We know the route home. But safety depends on circumstances, not simply familiarity. And on this particular evening, the circumstances were changing. A stranger was present. A stranger whose intentions Sabina could not see. A stranger who, according to prosecutors, had traveled to London with a purpose. The attack was brutal. Sabina was struck repeatedly with a heavy metal traffic object. The court heard that she was hit 34 times. She was eventually incapacitated. She was dragged toward another area. And she was strangled. The violence transformed the landscape. The same ground that had been part of an ordinary walk now contained the evidence of a killing. By morning, the park would no longer be simply a park. It would be the center of a murder investigation. September 18th began with discovery. A member of the public found Sabina's body near the One Space Community Center. The body had been partially concealed, but the area was secured, and the familiar neighborhood changed instantly. Police tape creates a psychological boundary as much as a physical one. On one side is everyday life. On the other is the place where something irreversible has happened. People living nearby may still need to walk the same streets. They may still need to go to work. They may still need to take children to school. But now they know that someone was murdered nearby. The landscape acquires a memory. A path that was previously just a path becomes the place where Sabina Nessa was last seen. A section of grass becomes the place where her body was discovered. A park becomes a crime scene. And a name becomes associated with a location. Sabina. For investigators, the next task was to freeze time. They needed to reconstruct the evening backward. What time had Sabina left home? What route had she taken? What did she do immediately before entering the park? Who else was nearby? Who appeared on camera? Who disappeared from view? Where did the killer come from? Where did he go afterward? These questions sound simple when listed one after another. In reality, answering them requires patience, so a person for a few seconds. A camera may be positioned at an awkward angle. A face may be hidden. A person may be wearing ordinary clothing that provides no obvious identification. The investigator must connect fragments. One camera gives a location. Another gives a direction. Another provides a time. Another shows a vehicle. And slowly, a moving human being becomes a line on a map. The investigation would eventually reveal that Selimai had been captured on CCTV. His movements could be followed. His presence could be connected to the area. And eventually, investigators traced him back to Eastbourne. But the setting tells us something important that a simple timeline cannot. The murder did not happen in isolation. It happened inside a living city. People were present nearby. Life continued. The crime was hidden inside normality. That is why the case generated such a powerful reaction. Sabina was not killed in some remote location that most people would never encounter. She was killed during a short walk through an area near home. And the circumstances were frighteningly familiar to millions of people. Walk to meet a friend. Walk home from a shortcut. These are ordinary decisions. The case forced people to reconsider the assumption that ordinary decisions always lead to ordinary outcomes. At the same time, it is important not to turn the geography of the crime into an accusation against the neighborhood itself. Cater Park did not cause Sabina's death. Kidbrooke did not cause her death. The city did not make the decision to attack her. A person did. That distinction matters. When a terrible crime occurs in a familiar place, people often begin to associate the location itself with danger. But places do not possess intentions. People do. The park was simply where the offender and victim crossed paths. The responsibility belonged to the man who chose violence. And this is precisely why investigators needed to understand Selimai rather than simply the location. Who was he? What had brought him to London? What had happened in the hours before Sabina was killed? What was he looking for? The answers would gradually emerge. There was evidence of previous violence toward a woman who had been his partner. At one point, he had placed his hands around her neck. That detail would later become significant because Sabina had also died. Not simply take a disturbing detail and declare it proof of a motive. They needed evidence. They needed a chain of facts. They needed to demonstrate what had happened, not merely what might have happened. That principle would guide the investigation. The police had a dead woman. They had a crime scene. They had CCTV. They had a suspect. Now they needed to connect the pieces. The case would become a race against uncertainty. Every minute of CCTV footage could potentially contain something important. Every route taken by Selimai could reveal another part of the story. Every piece of evidence could either strengthen or weaken the case. And gradually, the darkness surrounding Sabina's final journey began to lift. Not because the night itself had changed, but because investigators were reconstructing it. The cameras had preserved fragments. The detectives were connecting them. And the person who had believed he could disappear into the darkness had left behind a trail. That trail would lead investigators away from Cater Park and back toward Eastbourne. But even after the suspect was identified, one question remained more difficult than all the others. What had been happening inside his mind before he encountered Sabina? Investigators where he went. CCTV could show them how he moved. Evidence could establish what he had done. But motive required something deeper. It required understanding the sequence of choices. The failed encounter with his former partner. The visit to the hotel. The dispute. The journey to London. The search. The encounter with Sabina. The attack. The attempt to conceal what he had done. Each event existed on its own. But together, they formed the outline of a disturbing evening. And somewhere inside that sequence was the moment when Selimai stopped being simply a man traveling through London and became the person responsible for taking Sabina Nessa's life. For Sabina, there had been no such transformation. She remained herself until the final moments. A teacher. A daughter. A sister. A friend. A woman on her way to meet someone. That is why the setting should never be allowed to overshadow the person. Cater Park is important because it is where the crime happened. Kidbrooke is important because it was part of Sabina's world. Eastbourne is important because it was connected to the suspect. London's truth. But none of these places is the story by itself. The story is the life that moved through them. Sabina left one place. She intended to reach another. She never arrived. And between those 2 points was a stretch of ordinary London that became the setting for an extraordinary tragedy. The following investigation would take detectives through that geography again and again. They would retrace the route. They would examine the cameras. They would follow the suspect. They would reconstruct the night. And with every step, the question would become less about where Sabina had gone and more about what had been waiting for her. Because the most frightening part of the setting was not the darkness. It was the person inside it. A stranger who had come to London. A stranger who had moved through the city looking for an opportunity. A stranger whose path crossed with Sabina's for only a short time. And a stranger who would eventually stand in court and admit that he had murdered her. But before that admission, there would be an investigation. A long examination of movements, evidence, and motive. And at the center of it all would remain one quiet fact. Sabina had been walking through a place she knew. She believed she was simply crossing the neighborhood, already being watched. Not by someone trying to protect her, but by cameras that would later become the silent witnesses to what happened. The city had recorded the path. The park had preserved the location. And the investigation was about to turn those fragments into a story. A story that would begin with the last ordinary minutes of Sabina Nessa's life. And end with the identification of the man who had been hiding in the darkness. London is a city built around movement. Every day, millions of people leave one place and travel toward another. They cross roads, pass through stations, walk along pavements, cut through parks and take familiar shortcuts without giving those journeys a second thought. The city teaches people to move almost automatically. You learn the quickest route to work. You learn which road leads home. You learn where the traffic is usually heavy and which paths can save you several minutes. For the people who live in southeast London, places such as Kidbrooke and Cater Park are not simply names on a map. They are part of everyday life. Kidbrooke is a residential area where ordinary routines unfold behind ordinary doors. People leave for work in the morning and return in the evening. Children go to school. Shops open and close. Neighbors encounter one another without necessarily knowing each other's names. It was in this familiar environment that Sabina Nessa had built her life. She was not a visitor passing through London for the first time. This was her neighborhood. And on the evening of Friday, September 17, 2021, she was making one of the simplest journeys imaginable. She was walking to meet a friend. The destination was a nearby bar. The journey should have been measured in minutes, not hours. At approximately 8:30 p.m., Sabina left her home in Kidbrooke. She stepped into the evening with no reason to believe that anything unusual was about to happen. There was no dramatic beginning to the night. No confrontation. No threatening message. No warning from someone who knew what was waiting ahead. Just a young woman leaving home. That ordinary beginning is important because the tragedy of Sabina's death cannot be understood simply by looking at the final moments. To understand how disturbing the crime was, we have to understand how normal the setting was before everything changed. Cater Park was part of that ordinary landscape. It was a green space within southeast London, surrounded by the streets and buildings of a living neighbourhood. People could use it as during the day, it could be simply another place to walk, exercise, or pass through. But nighttime changes the character of familiar places. The same path that appears open and visible during daylight can become darker and more isolated after sunset. Trees become silhouettes. Distances become harder to judge. A person several meters away can disappear into shadow. Familiar surroundings remain physically unchanged, yet the human perception of them changes completely. On that Friday evening, Sabina entered this environment while traveling toward her destination. She did not know that another person was nearby. She did not know his name. She had no reason to recognize him. And there was nothing connecting their lives before that moment. The man was Koki Selamai. He was 36 years old. He lived in Eastbourne, East Sussex, and worked at a garage. Unlike Sabina, he was not simply part of the neighborhood. According to evidence later presented in court, he had traveled from Eastbourne to London that day. That journey would eventually become an important part of the prosecution's reconstruction of the crime. Investigators would not only ask what happened in Cater Park. They would ask what happened before Selamai ever arrived there. What had he done? Why had he traveled to London? And what was he intending to do? Those questions would become increasingly important as the investigation developed. Earlier that day, Selamai had encountered his former partner. Evidence presented during the proceedings described an unsuccessful attempt to initiate sexual activity. Later, he went to a hotel in Eastbourne where she had worked, and a dispute arose concerning payment. None of those events, taken alone, explains the murder. But criminal investigations rarely depend upon one isolated fact. They examine sequences. They examine behavior. They look at what happened before, during and after an offense. And in Selamai's case, prosecutors would later argue that the events of that day formed part of a disturbing progression that culminated in his journey to London and his encounter with Sabina. The prosecution's case was that he had gone to London looking for a woman to attack. If that was true, then Cater Park was not simply the location where an argument unexpectedly became violent. It was the setting in which a predatory intention encountered a victim. And Sabina had no way of knowing that. That is one of the most frightening features of the case. The victim and the romantic history. No financial dispute between them. No family connection. No personal feud. No previous argument. Sabina did not know the man who would kill her. There was nothing in her relationship with him that could have warned her. She could not have looked at him and recognized an old enemy. She could not have received a threatening message from him earlier that day. She could not have understood that her presence was potentially dangerous. She was simply there. And that is why the physical environment becomes so significant. The park was not dangerous because of its trees or its paths. It was dangerous because a dangerous person happened to be there. The location itself had no intention. The responsibility belonged entirely to the man who chose to attack her. According to evidence later presented at the Old Bailey, Selamai approached Sabina from behind. The attack was sudden. She was struck repeatedly with a heavy metal traffic object. The court heard that she was hit 34 times. She was eventually incapacitated. She was dragged toward another area. And then she was strangled. The violence was over quickly enough that the surrounding city could continue without immediately knowing what had happened. That taking place inside a city that never truly sleeps. People moving through nearby streets. Lights glowing behind windows. Vehicles traveling along roads. Phones being checked. Conversations continuing. Plans being made for the weekend. While in Cater Park, a young woman's life was ending. Nothing about the city announced the crime. There was no immediate public understanding that something terrible had happened. For Sabina's family and friends, the night would initially have looked completely different. They would have been waiting for her to arrive. At first, a delay does not necessarily feel frightening. A person can be late. A phone can be unanswered. Plans can change. The mind searches for ordinary explanations because ordinary explanations are what we expect. But Sabina did not arrive. And as time passed, the absence became increasingly difficult to explain. The following day, September 18th, the mystery ended in the worst possible way. A member of the public discovered Sabina's body in Cater Park, near the One Space Community Center. Her body had been partially concealed by grass and vegetation. The discovery immediately transformed the area. Police were ordinary landscape of the neighborhood became a forensic environment. Every movement around the scene now had significance. Every object could potentially matter. Every person who had been nearby might have information. And every camera covering the surrounding area suddenly became important. The investigation began with a simple but enormous task. Reconstruct the night. Detectives needed to determine where Sabina had gone after leaving home. They needed to establish the route she had taken. They needed to determine when she entered Cater Park. They needed to identify anyone who had been near her. And most importantly, they needed to identify the person responsible. Fortunately, London had left behind a record. CCTV cameras had captured parts of the movements taking place that evening. The cameras were not human witnesses. They had no understanding of what they were recording. They could not recognize fear. They could not understand violence. They could not intervene. But they could preserve time and movement. That was enough. Investigators began examining footage. A person appeared on one camera. Then disappeared. Another camera showed movement farther along the route. Piece by piece, a journey could be reconstructed. The darkness that had hidden the crime from ordinary observers was no longer completely impenetrable. There were images. There were timestamps. There were routes. There were movements. And eventually, there was a man. Koki Selamai. The investigation began to move toward him. But the cameras did more than place a suspect in the area. They helped investigators understand what had happened before and after the murder. His movements could be traced. His journey could be examined. His presence could be compared against Sabina's movements. The case was beginning to acquire a structure. Before that point, investigators had a murder and a location. Now they were beginning to have a suspect and a timeline. But a timeline creates new questions. Why had Selamai traveled to London? Why had he been in the area? Was Sabina deliberately selected? Had he been searching for someone? Or had he encountered her by chance? The prosecution would later argue that his behavior demonstrated planning. That distinction would become central to the case. Because there is a profound difference between violence that erupts unexpectedly and violence that in the first situation, the offender reacts. In the second, the offender searches. And if Selamai had traveled to London looking for a woman to attack, then the danger Sabina encountered had nothing to do with anything she had done. The danger had already existed. She simply crossed its path. That is perhaps the most unsettling part of the story. Sabina did not need to know the wrong person. She did not need to enter a secret meeting. She did not need to become involved in an argument. She did not need to make a reckless decision. She was walking through her own neighborhood. And a stranger decided to attack her. The case therefore became about much more than a single location. It became about the vulnerability contained within ordinary movement. Walking home. Walking to a friend's house. Crossing a park. Taking a familiar route. These are actions repeated by millions of people every day. Most end exactly as expected. You arrive. You meet your friend. You go home. You wake up the next morning and continue with your life. Sabina's journey was supposed to be exactly that. Instead, it became the last journey she would ever make. And the transformation of Keita of that fact. A place that had been part of everyday life was now associated with a murder. Police tape replaced routine. Forensic investigators replaced pedestrians. Questions replaced familiarity. People who lived nearby now knew that a young woman had been killed there. And perhaps most painfully, Sabina's family knew that the place had become permanently connected to the last moments of her life. But the investigation could not remain focused only on the park. The killer had come from somewhere. And after the attack, he had gone somewhere. Those movements mattered. The cameras would help investigators follow them. The route would lead away from the crime scene. Eventually, it would lead investigators back toward Eastbourne. Back toward the man who had traveled to London. Back toward Koki Selamai. The investigation was beginning to turn geography into evidence. Eastbourne. London. Kidbrooke. Keita Park. Each location represented another part of the story. But none of them, by itself, could explain the murder. That explanation required an examination of Selamai's behavior. Investigators would learn about his previous relationship in which he had placed his hands around his former partner's neck. They would examine the events of September 17th. They would examine his movements before traveling to London. And they would ask what was happening psychologically during those hours. There is always a danger in trying to explain a violent crime through psychology. Explanation is not the same as excuse. Understanding why someone behaves violently does not reduce their responsibility for choosing to do so. The investigation would not be about finding an excuse for Sabina's killer. It would be about understanding the sequence of choices that led to her death. The evidence would eventually show that Selamai was responsible. But before the courtroom, investigators had to build the case. They needed to establish where he had been. They needed to establish where Sabina had been. They needed to connect the two. And they needed to demonstrate that the encounter was not an innocent coincidence followed by an uncontrollable reaction. The evidence would become increasingly difficult to ignore. CCTV showed movements. The physical evidence established the violence. The timeline connected the events. And the suspect's own actions after the murder would become part of the story. Still, one question would never be a satisfying answer. She was not someone Selamai had known. She was not someone who had betrayed him. She was not someone who had threatened him. She was not someone who had caused him a personal loss. She was simply a woman walking through a park. That absence of connection is what makes random predatory violence so frightening. The victim can be entirely innocent. The victim can have no idea the offender exists. And the offender can still decide that the victim will become the object of his violence. Sabina's life, however, cannot be reduced to the final minutes in Keita Park. Before she became the subject of a murder investigation, she had been a teacher. She had worked with young children at Rushy Green Primary School in Catford. She had colleagues. She had students. She had family and friends. She had a life that existed outside the crime scene. That life is essential to remembering who she was. The murder did not create Sabina's identity. It only interrupted it. Her story had begun long before the evening of September 17th. She had spent years becoming the person her family and friends knew. She had built a career. She had formed relationships. She had dreams to continue. The man who attacked her did not merely take away one evening. He took away every future day that Sabina should have lived. Every birthday she should have celebrated. Every classroom she should have entered. Every conversation she should have had. Every ordinary morning that should have followed that Friday night. That is what is hidden inside the simple phrase murder victim. A future has been erased. And while investigators were working to identify the person responsible, Sabina's family was left with something no evidence could replace. Her absence. The investigation could establish the facts. The court could establish guilt. The sentence could establish punishment. But none of those things could return her. That would remain true even after Selimai eventually admitted the murder. But at this stage of the story, the investigation was still unfolding. Detectives were following the trail. The cameras were being examined. The movements were being reconstructed. And the man who believed he could move through the city unnoticed had left behind enough evidence for investigators to begin following him. The setting was no longer just Cater Park. The setting had expanded. It included every road between locations. Every place Selimai had visited. Every location that could establish his timeline. The city itself had become a map of the crime. And detectives were reading that map. Slowly, methodically, they were moving from the victim to the suspect. From Cater Park to Eastbourne. From the body to the journey. From the murder scene to the man. But the deeper they went, the more disturbing the picture became. Because the evidence suggested that this was not simply a tragedy born from one uncontrolled moment. The prosecution would argue that Selimai had made a series of choices. He had traveled. He had searched. He had approached. He had attacked. And he had killed. Each step mattered. Each decision brought him closer to Sabina. And each decision belonged to him. Sabina did not create those choices. She did not cause them. She did not invite them. She simply became the person whose path intersected with them. That is why the geography of the case is so powerful. The distances involved were real. Eastbourne was real. London was real. Kidbrooke was real. Cater Park was real. But the most important distance was the distance at all. Sabina was walking toward a friend. Selimai was moving toward violence. Their paths crossed. And in that brief intersection, an entire future disappeared. By the time investigators began following the CCTV trail, the physical scene could no longer tell the whole story. The park could show where Sabina had been found. It could preserve evidence. It could establish location. But it could not explain what had happened inside the mind of the man who attacked her. For that, detectives would have to follow him. They would have to reconstruct his day. They would have to examine the events before the murder. They would have to understand his movements. And eventually, they would have to confront him with the evidence. The quiet paths of Cater Park had given investigators their starting point. The cameras would give them direction. And the road to Eastbourne would begin revealing the man behind the crime. Because somewhere beyond the police tape, beyond the grass and the trees, beyond the final place where Sabina had been seen alive, there was a suspect who had left the scene. He had a name. He had a home. He had a journey. And he had a trail. The investigation was about to follow every step. By the time darkness, 2021, the city had already begun its familiar transformation. The daytime rush was fading. Office buildings were emptying. People were leaving buses and trains, carrying shopping bags, backpacks, and the small exhaustion that comes at the end of a working week. Friday night was beginning. For some people, it meant meeting friends. For others, it meant going home. For families, it meant dinner, television, homework, and the quiet routines that make up ordinary life. And somewhere within that enormous city, Sabina Nessa was walking toward a friend. She had left her home in Kidbrooke at approximately 8:30 p.m. The destination was a nearby bar. It was the kind of journey that usually requires no special planning. You know where you are going. You know the streets. You know roughly how long it will take. You expect to arrive. Then you expect to return home. That expectation is so deeply embedded in ordinary life that we rarely acknowledge it. We leave our homes assuming that we will come back. We walk down a familiar road assuming that it will remain familiar. We pass strangers without wondering whether one of them might be dangerous. We enter a park without imagining that the same place could later. Sabina had no reason to think differently. She was 28 years old. She was a primary school teacher. She had built a life around people who knew her, cared about her, and expected to see her again. Her evening was not supposed to become significant. It was supposed to be forgotten. And then she entered Cater Park. The park was not isolated from civilization. It existed within the neighborhood, surrounded by the streets and buildings of southeast London. For people living nearby, it was part of the geography of everyday life. A route. A green space. A familiar piece of the community. But darkness changes the way people experience familiar places. During daylight, a park can feel open. You can see the paths. You can see people approaching. You can see the surrounding buildings. At night, the same environment becomes fragmented. Light reaches only certain areas. Trees and bushes create pockets of darkness. A person can be only a short distance away and remain difficult to identify. The city does not disappear. It simply becomes harder to read. On that night, Sabina was walking through that changing landscape. She had no reason to. There was no known relationship between them. No argument had preceded the encounter. No personal history existed between them. The man was a stranger. His name was Koki Selamai. He was 36 years old. He lived in Eastbourne, East Sussex, and worked at a garage. And unlike Sabina, he had not simply been traveling through his own neighborhood. According to the evidence later presented in court, he had traveled from Eastbourne to London that day. That fact would become one of the first pieces of a much larger puzzle. Because when a murder appears random, investigators begin by asking whether it truly was. Was the victim selected? Was the offender looking for someone? Was the meeting accidental? Did the violence erupt unexpectedly? Or had the intention to commit violence existed before the victim was ever encountered? Those questions would eventually become central to the case. The prosecution argued that Selamai had traveled to London with the intention of finding a woman to attack. If that interpretation was correct, then the setting of the murder takes on an even more disturbing meaning. Cater Park was not necessarily the place where an ordinary disagreement went wrong. It was the place where a man searching for an opportunity, not because of something she had done to him, but because she happened to cross his path. That distinction matters. It means that Sabina could not have known the danger by looking for a familiar warning sign. There was no threatening relationship. There was no history she could remember. There was no reason for her to think that this stranger had any particular interest in her. She was simply walking. And somewhere behind her, the distance between the two strangers was closing. The attack that followed was sudden and extreme. According to evidence presented at the Old Bailey, Selamai approached Sabina from behind. He attacked her with a heavy metal traffic object. The court heard that he struck her 34 times. The violence was sustained. Sabina was eventually incapacitated. She was dragged toward another area. Then she was strangled. The physical setting that had been ordinary only minutes earlier had become the final scene of her life. But there was no immediate announcement. No siren that told the surrounding neighborhood what had happened. No public warning. No visible sign to most people passing through the wider area that a woman had just been murdered. London continued moving. That is the strange cruelty of a city. One people continue with theirs. A train can still arrive on time. A restaurant can still serve dinner. A child can still fall asleep. A couple can still discuss their weekend plans. A driver can still stop at a traffic light. And somewhere nearby, a family can unknowingly be living through the final hours before their world changes forever. For Sabina's family, the first signs would have been absence. She had not arrived. She had not returned. The explanations that naturally come to mind in such circumstances are ordinary ones. Perhaps she had been delayed. Perhaps she had stopped somewhere. Perhaps she had become distracted. Perhaps her phone was unavailable. The human mind resists catastrophe. It searches for the harmless explanation first. But Sabina would never arrive at the bar. She would never return home. And the following day, the truth would emerge. On September 18th, a member of the public discovered her body in Cater Park, near the One Space Community Center. Her body was partially concealed by grass and vegetation. The discovery immediately changed the meaning of the entire location. What had been a public park became a crime scene. Police officers arrived. Began examining the surroundings. The question was no longer whether Sabina was missing. She was dead. Now they had to find the person responsible. And to do that, they had to reconstruct time. That is where the modern city became important. London had been watching. Not consciously. Not deliberately. But through the cameras positioned around its roads and public spaces. CCTV footage would become one of the most important sources of evidence in the investigation. The cameras could not tell investigators what Sabina had been feeling. They could not reveal what the killer was thinking. But they could establish movement. They could establish direction. They could establish timing. A person appears. A person disappears. Another camera captures the same figure farther along. A vehicle moves through a junction. A pedestrian enters one frame and later appears in another. The fragments begin to connect. And when enough fragments are connected, an investigator can reconstruct a journey. That was what detectives began doing. They followed Sabina's movements. They followed the movements of the man who appeared near her. And slowly, the unknown figure acquired an identity. Gators somewhere to look. But a name is only the beginning. They needed to understand where he had been. They needed to establish how he had traveled. They needed to know what had happened before he encountered Sabina. They needed to know what happened afterward. And most importantly, they needed to determine whether the evidence supported the conclusion that he was responsible for her death. As the investigation developed, events from earlier that day became significant. Selimai had encountered his former partner. Evidence presented during the case described an unsuccessful attempt to initiate sexual activity. Later, he went to a hotel in Eastbourne where she had worked. A dispute followed concerning payment. Those events did not, by themselves, prove anything about Sabina's murder. But they formed part of the sequence prosecutors would ask the court to consider. The investigation also uncovered evidence of previous violence toward a woman who had been his partner. At one point, Selimai had placed his hands around her neck. That detail would later be particularly disturbing because strangulation was the method by which Sabina's life ended. But investigators still had to be careful. A previous act of violence does not automatically prove a later murder. When did it happen? Where did it happen? Who was responsible? What evidence connected the suspect to the crime? And what did his actions reveal about the events leading up to Sabina's death? The physical location could answer only some of those questions. Cater Park could tell investigators where Sabina had been found. It could provide physical evidence. It could help establish the route. But it could not tell investigators why Selimai had traveled there. For that, they had to follow him. And that meant leaving the park. The investigation began expanding outward. From the crime scene to the surrounding streets. From the streets to CCTV. From CCTV to the suspect's movements. And from those movements back toward Eastbourne. The map of the investigation was becoming larger. Eastbourne. London. Kidbrooke. Cater Park. Each place was another point in the story. Each movement connected one point to another. The more detectives understood the route, the more difficult it became to see the murder as an isolated moment. The evidence was beginning to suggest a sequence. A journey. A search. A departure. And eventually, an attempt to understand what had happened. Yet the most troubling question remained. Why Sabina? There was no obvious personal reason. She was not someone Selimai had known. She had not been involved in his earlier life. She had not caused the disputes that had occurred earlier that day. She had no apparent connection to his anger or frustration. She was simply there. That randomness would make the case particularly frightening to the public. Because if the victim and offender have no relationship, the usual rules people use to understand danger become less useful. There is no suspicious relationship to identify. No feud to avoid. No obvious warning. The victim may have no idea that the offender exists. And that is exactly what happened to Sabina. She was walking through a place that belonged to her everyday world. She had no idea that the man she was about to encounter had traveled to London. She had no idea what had happened earlier that day. She had no idea what was taking place inside his mind. She could only see what was in front of her. The path. The darkness. The surrounding park. And whatever ordinary end. Perhaps she was thinking about what they would talk about. Perhaps she was thinking about work. Perhaps she was thinking about the weekend. Perhaps she was thinking about nothing important at all. We will never know. That is another cruel element of the case. The final thoughts of a victim are often unknowable. Investigators can reconstruct movements. They can establish times. They can recover messages and footage. But there is a private interior world that disappears with the person. Sabina's final thoughts belong only to her. What remains for everyone else is the evidence. And the evidence told a devastating story. She had entered Cater Park alive. She had been attacked. She had been killed. Her body had been left behind. And the person responsible had walked away. But he had not walked away without leaving a trail. CCTV had captured pieces of his movements. Those images would become crucial. The cameras did not prevent the murder. They did not protect Sabina. But afterward, they helped investigators begin pulling the darkness apart. The city had unknowingly recorded the path. Now detectives had to interpret it. Every frame, silhouette. A direction. A timestamp. A vehicle. A street. A turn. The investigation would be built from fragments. And eventually, those fragments would point toward one man. The setting therefore became more than a park. It became a network of locations. A journey through London. A trail extending back to Eastbourne. A sequence of movements that investigators could follow. And at the center of that sequence was a woman who had expected to spend an ordinary Friday evening with a friend. Instead, she became the victim of a stranger's violence. The transformation of Cater Park after the murder would remain symbolic. Before September 17th, it was simply part of the neighborhood. After September 18th, people knew it as the place where Sabina Nessa had been found. The landscape had acquired a memory. A path could never again be entirely anonymous. The name Cater Park would forever be linked to the name Sabina. But it is important to remember that the park itself was not responsible. The streets were not responsible. The darkness was not responsible. The city was not responsible. One man made the choices that led to the murder. Detail. The prosecution would argue that Selimai had traveled to London looking for a woman to attack. The evidence would show his movements. The court would hear about his actions. And eventually, the legal system would determine his responsibility. But before any of that could happen, detectives had to build the bridge between the crime scene and the suspect. That bridge was evidence. CCTV. Physical evidence. Witness information. The timeline. The suspect's movements. And the circumstances surrounding the day. The investigation was beginning to move rapidly. The quiet park where Sabina's body had been discovered was now only the starting point. The cameras were pointing investigators toward the wider city. The wider city was pointing them toward Eastbourne. And Eastbourne was pointing them toward the man whose actions had brought him into Sabina's final journey. The deeper investigators looked, the less likely it became that the truth would remain hidden. Because the city had preserved something the killer could not erase. His movements. His route. His presence. His return. And every step brought detectives closer. But the most difficult part was still ahead. Understanding the crime was another. What had happened in the hours before Selimai encountered Sabina? What had driven him from Eastbourne to London? What did he intend to do when he arrived? Was Sabina chosen because of who she was? Or was she chosen simply because she was the woman who happened to be walking through Cater Park at the wrong moment? The answers would come through the investigation. They would emerge from evidence that, at first, seemed disconnected. A journey. A former relationship. A hotel. A dispute. A trip to London. A park. A stranger. A young teacher. And then violence. The pieces were beginning to form a picture. It was a picture that would eventually lead to a courtroom. But before the courtroom, there was the investigation. Before the investigation, there was the crime scene. And before the crime scene, there was the ordinary evening. Sabina leaving home. The city moving around her. The darkness gathering. A short journey toward a friend. And a stranger waiting somewhere along the way. The setting was ordinary. The consequences were not. And as detectives began to discover that the most important clues were not hidden in some distant place. They were scattered across the same city through which the killer had moved. The cameras had seen him. The streets had recorded his journey. And the investigation was about to turn those silent witnesses into evidence.